Ladies and gentlemen, thank you all very much for coming along this afternoon. And we really are extreme. I mean, this is an extraordinary moment. I write royal books, among other things. And so for a royal writer, it really is an extraordinary position to be in, to be able to say, Your Majesty, welcome. And also, Her Majesty is also here in the audience, Queen Margarita as well. But King Simeon of the Bulgarians, in fact, Tsar Simeon of the Bulgarians, he is the last Tsar. I'm sorry, in all the literature it calls you king, but you are a Tsar, aren't you?
Well, that's the way we call our kings, but it's not anything higher than a usual normal king.
Just a sort of entry level Tsar then. But born in 1937, Simeon II of the Bulgarians is utterly unique in European and pretty much in world history as being both monarch and prime minister of the same nation, and it's an extraordinary thing. His life, honestly, his book is on sale in the bookshop, and I mean, there isn't anyone, frankly, from the 40s to the present day whom he hasn't met. And he has lived an extraordinary life, as we're going to hear. But I thought I would start, if I may, sir, by I happened to see you from my vantage point commentating on the Queen's funeral the other day. There you were, obviously, because you are a cousin of Her late Majesty. Perhaps, as that's fresh in everyone's minds, I could just start by asking you how you found the Queen's funeral and maybe one or two of your memories of Her late Majesty.
Well, it was deeply moving, and especially the whole atmosphere. You could see that the entire nation was sort of participating and feeling that some member of their family has gone. So it was, as I say, and then of course to lose somebody I dare say have known since 1958 was for us personally also very, very sad, but not that I'm judging, but I must say that the whole organization was concentrated perfection. Although somebody in the court said, no, it's rather organized chaos.
Well, it looked pretty organized to me.
Fantastic.
Yeah. And just I mean, you met Her Majesty many times. One thing that always sticks in my mind is that in her Diamond Jubilee, she gathered all the world's monarchs together for a lunch, which must have been the trickiest protocol problem ever for the master of the household, because there was a photograph before lunch. And how do you arrange a seating plan for 27 people who are all called Your Majesty and who bow to no one? What happened? Because you were there. Where did you end up sitting, sir?
To the Queen's left.
You were next to her?
Because it's, yes, but it happens because it's from the years that you're on duty. It's like in diplomats. The years that you're in a country is the seniority. It's not the size of the country or the direct family connection or anything. It's just by that. So it's still a tricky issue for protocol. There's no question about it.
So you were sitting on her right?
Left.
No,
left on
because
her right
Ewan
was Michael of Romania,
Michael of
who was
Romania.
slightly senior to me.
So
yes, age-wise and the years he had been on duty.
Yeah.
But I'll just say this because you're talking about Her late Majesty. In '58, when I first called on the Queen, it was the first time that our branch of the family met again after World War II. You know that we were on the wrong side anyway, and so the conversation wasn't as fluent as it could be. And I told Her Majesty something which amused her enormously, and it immediately, not that there was any ice, but made things much more pleasant. I mentioned that we had been bombed, our palace, compliments of the RAF in '44, and a huge 2,000-pounder bomb fell close to the palace, missed it, fortunately, and the groundwater came up, and there was a sort of 35 or 40-foot crater, which filled up, and the regent, my uncle, said, in spring, we're going to put water lilies and a few stone slabs around, and we'll call it Lake Churchill. And I told Her Majesty this, and she thought that was quite good. And so things started.
Well, that's wonderful. I mean, let's rewind really to your childhood, because you were a boy king. But just tell me about your early years. I mean, you were born in 1937, the son of King Boris, who in turn has replaced your grandfather, King Ferdinand, who abdicated after the First World War. So just tell us about what it was like growing up towards the end of the 30s in Bulgaria.
Well, for a child, I can't really see it as a grown-up, but as long as my father was there, it was a sort of happy little prince. But the moment my father passed away, I suddenly had to act or be considered like a grown-up. So that was quite a shock.
But those before your father died, in your book you talk very happy memories of hiking with him.
Yes,
it was a happy family existence.
He loved mountain hiking or climbing, and my parents were very united. So it was, as you say, a happy family, plus my elder sister.
And then, and of course, your mother was the daughter of the King of Italy.
Yes.
So there's a bit of, I think you talk in there about, you have a sort of, you're half Italian, effectively.
Indeed.
And then suddenly, there's this awful moment when your father is summoned to Berlin. Do you want to tell us what happened?
Well, it was already in the eastern Prussia where the headquarters was, and that was in August 43. And Hitler was absolutely adamant about asking our troops to go to the Eastern Front, which my father categorically refused, because he knew that Bulgarian troops against Russia would really not be willing for the role that Russia played to liberate us from the Ottoman presence or occupation, and because it would have been wrong for the country after the war. So my father said no, and this obviously upset, not to say enraged, Hitler. And the second no was that my father refused that our Jewish population should be molested or deported. And there again, there was a big clash. So he returned from this meeting in exhausted state. Then he came back on Saturday. On Monday, he felt ill and died the next Saturday. So he was only 49 and a pretty healthy person. So
and tell me, why do you think he was murdered? I mean, in your book, you go through the various.
Yes, because I'm very, I would say, pragmatic or down to earth. I don't like theories and all this. There's something wrong, basically, because at 49 and being healthy, the symptoms of his week-long agony were not quite what you'd expect from a massive heart attack. So there always is a doubt. And then if you look at it politically, we would say, cui bono? I mean, is it the Soviets that were interested in eliminating him, actually? Was it the Nazis who wanted to punish him? But they were so afraid that it would destabilize the country. So whether it was any other influence, that I don't think we'll ever know, unfortunately.
And so, just to rewind very quickly for the benefit of the audience, but Bulgaria has been, and correct me if I'm wrong here, Bulgaria has been occupied by the Ottomans for centuries.
5 centuries.
5 centuries, and then finally,
1878.
yeah, and then becomes an independent country, and they decide the best way to consolidate that and create a national identity is to have a monarchy.
Yes, the first monarch was Earl Mountbatten's uncle, Alexander Battenberg, but unfortunately, the Russian Emperor Alexander III, for some reason, was jealous or detested his cousin and did everything for him to be removed from the throne. And then our parliament had to look around in Europe to find another potential ruler, and that's when my grandfather came into the.
So he's Ferdinand Saxe-Coburg-Gotha.
Yeah.
And he's king. He then reigns and is does all sorts
till
of
1918 from
brings lots of
82,
innovations into the country,
yes,
the railways
because
and all sorts of things.
he was a very learned man, and then he had a formidable mother who was a daughter of King Louis Philippe of France, who had a huge fortune with which she really financed many of the things which are completely in other places state financed, but just to help and back her son. So this was very fortunate for all of us, and to introduce the country back into Europe.
And he reigns up until
1918,
and then he has to abdicate because of
the issue of World War I.
World War I. Your father becomes king. He has to face down at least 2 or 3 coup attempts, doesn't he, and an assassination
Well, there were
attempt.
very difficult periods in Europe, and especially in southeastern Europe. And then he passed away after 25 years. I mean, a few days short of 25 years of rule.
And then suddenly, there are you. You are the new king. So when do what age are you at this point? You're
6.
6, okay. And when are you first conscious of the fact that you're now the head of state? What's the moment when you're aware
that my father's ADC came up and addressed me as Your Majesty instead of Your Royal Highness. And that suddenly was a shock, because I realized that my father was dead.
Yeah. And you had to, here's your country, it's in the middle of the war. Your mother is obviously a regent figure.
Well,
but
she was not, because by the constitution, we had 3 regents, but of course she was very important, and to me she was the mother, father, queen, teacher, and also a very severe person.
But she's looking after you. But as you say, yes, you've got 3 regents, including your uncle. What sort of duties were you expected to perform at the age of 6?
Well, there was some reception in the palace of members of parliament or some delegation, but basically few, because after all, a child of my age couldn't really perform too actively such duties.
But there were moments where you had a uniform, weren't there, and you had to be presented.
Well, we had to, yes. I remember some of the delegations that came from my father's death, and afterwards also during the latter part of the war. But
didn't the Emperor of Japan send a delegation?
Yes, a brother of his came with the chief of staff of Japan. It was quite interesting, because in their culture they're always so, details are so important. They knew that my father was an entomologist, and so they thought that first they would try and catch some butterflies from Bulgaria, so they would bring them back to the emperor in Tokyo as a sort of honor to my father's hobby, if you like. And of course, everybody was a bit worried, because in the middle of the war, to have the chief of general staff doing this with the butterfly net. It's actually, it shows to what extent they were, I mean, their courtesy and their detail, but at the same time, it was more important for our armed forces to see the chief of staff of the Imperial Army attend some maneuvers.
And then, of course, the course of the war means that the Russians are getting closer, and then what happens?
Well, then there was the coup in September 44, an unusual thing, because the Soviets invaded us without having declared war. We had the Soviet minister, in those days they were not ambassadors, in Sofia, and yet the country was invaded. They called it liberation, but obviously it was not quite this way.
And your uncle, the senior regent, Uncle Kirill, he's summoned to Moscow.
They were arrested, the 3 regents, and taken to Moscow to be interrogated, and then brought back to be put on trial for obviously high treason, no less. So, but these things happen in war. There's little ration. There's only, I don't know, hatred or resentment or trying to get even, but it's not rationally thought, unfortunately.
And so suddenly your uncle, the other 2 regents, they're executed. I think they no marked grave either, were they? They were just taken away.
No, that all the 125 cabinet ministers, military and so forth, plus my uncle, were executed and put in actually in a bomb crater.
And you were then under the tutelage of three new
regions, the senior of which was one of our Marxist ideologists, who came to convey his deepest sympathy to my mother for the executions, which is really, I mean the limit of cynism, but there we are. As I say, in those situations, people are not rational or do not reason in a normal way, unfortunately.
And I think at this point, your mother is quite keen to just get the hell out, take her children. And what is it that they say to her?
Well, it must have been very difficult for her. She was only 39 with two small children, and seeing the horrendous, murders and killings and so forth. So she said that she wanted to leave and go to Egypt, where her parents had just arrived in exile. And so the Minister of Foreign Affairs said, "Madam, there's a boat leaving 20 days from now, from Odessa, from Varna, going to Odessa first in the Soviet Union, and then going to Alexandria, Egypt, and another leaving the day after tomorrow from Istanbul and sailing directly to Alexandria." And of course, in 46, the Romanov tragedy was much closer, and when my mother heard Odessa, she immediately said, no, we're leaving on the day after tomorrow. So in the confusion, among other strange things, I wasn't asked to abdicate. So
they forgot to get an abdication out of the king before he left.
Maybe they were so pleased to see us leave. It depends.
But so from the time the Russians arrived in 44 to 46, you're under the sort of Soviet occupation.
Yes, absolutely.
And then you go, and it's an extraordinary story. Just your train journey, because you have to get a train from Sofia to Istanbul. And tell us what happens as I think you write in your book that you're by now you're 9 years old, but you've had to grow up at a rate of knots, and you're very worried that when you get on the train, someone's going to shoot you. Isn't that right?
In the middle of the night, the train stopped at the Bulgarian border, and the whole problem was that the train driver or conductor, what you call him, refused to take us out of the country. He said he'd rather be shot or what have you. And so we had to wait for a Turkish locomotive to steam up and then come and pull our convoy to Turkey. So it was a very touching movement. We never knew what happened with that person.
He probably, what do you think might have happened?
He could have been interned in a labor camp or something.
And anyway, so the train goes on to Istanbul, and so suddenly, age 9, you haven't abdicated. You're still king, but you set sail and you then start a new life initially in Egypt.
Egypt, yes.
And that sounds rather interesting, because there you are. You're at school with all sorts of interesting people.
Well, it was the best school in the Middle East, which was obviously English. It was the Victoria College in Alexandria. And it so happened that there was an enormous amount of young boys from that whole area, many of which became very, very known and important. One, which is a familiar name, obviously here too, was King Hussein of Jordan.
King Hussein of Jordan.
He was in my class, and then several from Libya, from those days they were called the Trucial States, which are now the Emirates, so that we've found each other later on in different positions, all from the Victoria College.
And then your mother she's keen to take you back to Italy, her homeland, but Italy won't have you.
Well, Italy said that she was welcome, but they were afraid that the People's Republic of Bulgaria would object to Italy having me as a refugee. So we had to look around, and
so even though you're 9, you're still a sort of threat to.
Well, more than a threat, it's just the principle for them. It was to make sure that we were sort of sideline or something. And then the Spanish ambassador in Cairo heard this and told my mother, "Madam, have you ever considered Spain?" Which, in actual fact, we had never considered. And it so happened, so after I spent 50 years in Spain, which is quite a long time.
So,
I was lucky to be there.
So off your mother and your sister, and you head off to Madrid, and essentially there you build a new life. And then at the age of 18, there's a very important ceremony. You've come of age, and you swear, you sort of reaffirm your role as the king.
Allegiance to the Constitution.
Because there had been no coronation, had there? You didn't.
No, we
should have said this earlier. There's no
only proclamation in Parliament. But this we did deliberately to show that we were keeping the spirit of a free Bulgaria, not the occupied People's Republic, which was, run by the Soviet Union.
And it's a very moving account of all these hundreds of Bulgarian emigres and exiles all coming to sort of pay homage, as it were, to their 18-year-old monarch.
Yes.
But you've still got to live your life, so you go off to military college in the USA, don't you?
Also.
Yeah.
My mother's opinion, very, I would say, old-fashioned, bless her soul, but she thought that a boy who hadn't gone through military was not, right. So I finally went to the US, which I thought was a very, very interesting experience. And it taught me a lot. So I'm very grateful for that.
And then you came back to Spain, and I think your mother put you in charge of fighting various court cases on behalf of the Italian royal family.
Yes, that I sort of attended and had to do it for her. And I got involved in so many things. I grew up very, very quickly.
Very quickly. And I think you thought about stirring it up a bit through radio broadcast back to Bulgaria.
Yes.
But General Franco, he had words with you, didn't he?
Well, Spain had a 1-hour program a day for all the communist-occupied countries. And when the Hungarian revolution occurred in '57, I thought of speaking on our Bulgarian hour to tell our people to stay calm, because I was sure that things would turn around in Hungary. And a friend of mine said, "Listen, you're so young, you're a refugee in Spain. It would be more correct or polite to ask Franco's opinion whether to speak on the radio or not." So I wrote 2 words, and I delivered the letter myself one afternoon at the residence of Generalissimo. And the next morning at 8:30, his ADC number 1 came with a handwritten letter, 5 pages, in which he said, "Thank you, Your Majesty, for asking me this. Since you are interested in my opinion, I would say that if you tell your people, go to the barricades, they will say, of course, he's not involved. He uses us to be butchered for his own interests. If you tell them, cool it, don't move or anything, they'll say, yes, he doesn't want trouble because he's in exile and he's happy as he is." And so Franco says, "Since you have asked me, I think you shouldn't pronounce yourself, because after the events, 51% of your fellow countrymen might think that you were wrong." And he says, "This is just a loyal piece of advice from your good friend Francisco Franco," which I thought was extraordinary, because the man ran the whole country. He had other headaches to sit down and write such a politically astute letter to an 18-year-old, brat.
And during this period, of course, that's when you meet Her Majesty, Queen Margherita, and I think you have 3 weddings, don't you? Because you've got to keep.
Well, maybe that's why we're still together. 61 years later, so that's quite a
very good.
Guinness Book of Records. But yes, indeed, we met, and we had the Catholic rite, the Swiss, because we had to marry in Switzerland, and there was a Swiss civil rite, and finally the Orthodox, which is my church, so that we were married 3 times, which makes divorce very difficult.
And you then embark on this sort of fascinating career where you're a businessman, but at the same time you're a sort of you're a friend of all these monarchs all over the world, really. I mean,
well, because most of them were related, so it's not more than friends. It's simply that it's members of the family. But of course, I had access to others who are not related, but who are kind enough to be on good terms.
Very friendly with the King of Morocco, for example.
Yes, who was a neighboring country, and we became very good friends. And he was a very learned man. And then I called on other monarchs who were not like King Hussein, with which we had been at school together. But basically, the Europeans, we are somehow all related, and there was a rule that whoever is older you call uncle or aunt, and whoever is your age, cousin, and with this you cover any problems.
But there's this rather fascinating cruise in the 50s organised by, I think, Queen Frederica of Greece. Yes. It's like, let's get all the sort of royal diaspora
after
together.
The war. It was after the war to have the 2 parts of the family to again.
So you're all cruising around the Med, sort of ship full of majesties and royal highnesses, and you become particularly friendly with the future Juan Carlos of Spain.
Also, and you see, it was a wonderful gimmick that the Queen thought for publicity for Greek tourism. And as a matter of fact, the Greek tourism really started in '54, because it was all over the news. We stop in one island, in another place, and suddenly people heard about these wonderful places. It was very, very clever, and besides, great fun for all of us. And that's where I also, well, we had seen King Juan Carlos already in Spain, but we became closer.
Yeah, and you know, the parallels with
being
him.
The same age.
Yeah, and you're there when he becomes king. And you're also, I mean, you're very close to him. Tell us about the time he faced down that coup. I mean, he, at one point Spain nearly descended into civil war again.
I'm not making any publicity for monarchy, but simply an observation. That's where the king, who's chief or commander-in-chief of the armed forces, has the weight to be able to secure the army and to make sure that, there's no nonsense. So I don't think, with all due respect, any president of the republic would carry this weight, because the king had already gone through the 3 military academies. He knew most of the officers. To make a long story short, he really went through a grueling night because he wasn't quite sure what was going to happen. And my wife and I, were in Switzerland, and our children were at school in Spain. So we were terrified that something would happen, because it could have turned into really, armed clashes or whatever. And so finally, at around 4 in the morning, I managed to get through to King Juan Carlos. And I said, listen, I'm so worried about our children. He said, Simeon, nothing to worry. Tell them to go to school tomorrow morning. I've told my sisters to do the same with their children and other friends, to show that it's business as usual, which I thought that was, really very cool-minded in such a terrible night. So I phoned early morning, and one of my sons who's here and his brothers were very disappointed, because they had heard that there was big problems, and they thought they would have holidays until things calmed down.
We've had a coup.
And they all had to go to school to prove that business as usual.
Well, and so we then come to the end of the 80s, and suddenly, the Berlin Wall comes down. You, all through this period, all this time, you've been a sort of focal point for exiles from your country. And suddenly things are changing across Eastern Europe. And tell me about your initial thoughts. Did you think this could be a time to restore the monarchy, or did you just think, perhaps at last I can actually go home?
Well, the main thing was that the Soviet system or empire imploded much faster than I had ever hoped or thought it would, and yet many very learned Kremlinologists were just as wrong as I was. I mean, they didn't think that the whole thing would end so fast. So it took us all by surprise. But quite honestly, to me, what was so thrilling and moving was that the country had a chance to become again free or independent. I wasn't really thinking, aha, that's a chance for the monarchy, because I'd been following things, and later on also, sometimes one can't turn the wheel of history back. One has to be realistic or pragmatic.
But gradually, the family go on sort of on trips just to sort of test the water.
Yes.
Starting, I think, with
my sister.
Your sister. She
was
went
in
back.
91 and got a very, very, I would say, positive reception. Then my mother in 93 for the 50 years since my father's death. And of course, we had the additional drama that during the last years of communism, when I was there in 46 already, they obliged us to take the remains of my father from the monastery where he was buried and bury him in the park where we lived, to humiliate us and to disturb us. And later on, they blew up the grave, so we never knew what happened to his remains. But the heart had been kept in the Anatomical Institute. And in 91, the head of the Academy of Sciences of Bulgaria called me in Madrid and said, Your Majesty, I've got your father's heart on my writing table. And I almost passed out away, because it was something so shocking and unexpected. So then in 1993, my mother went to rebury this heart in the original place in the big monastery of Rila, where it's to this day. So she went, and then in 1996, only 7 years after the events, I finally returned, because I had been putting my ear to the ground those years and seeing hundreds of people, if not, several. We got to a few thousand, but anyway, to get their opinion and feeling.
I think you consulted the Queen, didn't you? Tell us what the Queen said to you.
Oh, well, that was not directly, but in this wonderful, subtle way that Her Majesty had. She had heard that I was considering to return to Bulgaria, and we were having lunch here in Buckingham, and she said, Simeon, I hope you are not in much of a hurry or too much of a hurry or something, but not looking at me directly, but she just said it. So obviously I took heed of this message too, but we finally thought that the moment had come, and it was, because I'm not the one to say it, but the 15 days I spent there were such a tremendous success, triumph, or what have you.
Well, you're going to be modest, but the book opens with this extraordinary return. And I mean, even the grudging communists say only 500,000 people turned out to welcome the king home. In a country of 7 million, that's not bad.
No, not bad for a capital of 1 million. Yeah. So it was quite...
yeah, and you go all over the country, and it's incredibly moving,
we toured the country.
It? And you visit the memorial to the people who were shot for being loyal to your father.
Also,
you. Yeah.
But I always like to look forward, or at least in reality. I'm not the kind of person who looks back too much, or dreams, or is resentful, far from it. And I think it helped me further on in politics.
And so, well, let's get to that, because then you've come back. It's clear that there's a large body of people who welcome you back. They don't necessarily, and you say you don't necessarily want to restore the monarchy, but they like what you represent, the sort of stability you represent. And people, there are more and more sort of meetings, and you're gradually more and more established. And then you've sort of got this choice to make, haven't you? People are sort of saying, well, we want you back in some official capacity. And tell us why you couldn't go back as president. Several people said, why aren't you president?
Yes, some people thought president, which I personally didn't, feel too keen on, because the king president, It reminded me of Napoleon III or something a bit, almost a collision in one's own, how should I say, intellectually. But then some people hurried to say, oh, no, he can't run for president. He hasn't resided for the past 5 years in the country, because otherwise I had fulfilled. I'm born in Bulgaria, which is for our constitution a necessity. I was above 40, which is the second requirement, what we call it.
Yeah.
So the third was 5 years of residence. So with this, they eliminated me, and they probably were very pleased with this when I suddenly thought that since we are playing games, I'll run for parliament, but i.e. for the prime ministership. And obviously the prime minister in our constitution and in many countries is the executive power and has much more power or control of situations than had I just been a president. And that's when I had to face this. We had a landslide victory. Out of 240 members of parliament, 120 were of my party, and well, that's how.
It's amazing. So this is 2001, isn't it? You're elected, but you haven't got quite the majority. So you form a sort of coalition, don't you?
We had the Women's Party, which was something very new, that helped us too, and also our liberals who are part of our Muslims. So with that we had a very ample majority, and so I had my 4 years of without any problems, although there were 6 motions to what do you call it in English, to topple the government.
Yeah, a motion of no confidence motion.
But it didn't work.
And during that time, you had a visit from your cousin, the Prince of Wales, who was...
Well, he visit to our president.
Yes, but he came to Bulgaria.
He was at the level of our president, not at the level of our prime minister. So he came to Bulgaria indeed, and he was so blessed or established the correct business or decency in business association, which we have to this day, and has been, I mean, an example. And it was quite amusing because at the official lunch that the president gave King Charles, our president spoke, and then Prince Charles had to answer, and he said, Mr. President, there are 2 major differences since my last visit 4 years ago. So everybody was listening to hear what the Prince of Wales had to say. And he said, A, there is a new president, which was quite logical because 4 years, that's the term of a president in Bulgaria. And B, the prime minister happens to be my cousin, is another Saxe-Coburg. And everybody roared because the last thing they expected were these 2 amazing differences during the last years since he had visited Bulgaria previously.
But it was a key period for Bulgaria because under your prime ministership, you took Bulgaria into NATO, which is a huge thing, and you had to handle that very sensitively with Russia, didn't you? You didn't want to. It had to be done with a.
It was
great care.
Very difficult. And mind you, my goal was the EU. But we had to first join NATO. And having been very active in the Warsaw Pact, I thought it wasn't quite decent to go overnight from a Warsaw Pact army or armed forces to NATO, and hooray, NATO, and so forth. So I dragged my feet, and this brought me quite a few criticisms and ill feelings, saying that I had a Stockholm syndrome as far as Russia was concerned, and things like this. But anyway, we joined NATO.
And that paved the way for the EU.
It paved the way for the EU. It was an amusing incident. It was Lord Robertson, who was then Secretary General.
George Robertson.
And I was summoned to headquarters to be sort of questioned by the different ambassadors to see what this prime minister meant or was. And I managed to answer to 6 of the countries in their language, and which I think made it sort of very varied atmosphere. And walking out, Lord Robertson looked at me and said, "Prime Minister, I had never seen such a performance." And so it was so funny, because he really was surprised to see that you could answer in different languages, but that was
The translators
very
had a
fortunate.
pretty easy day.
So it helped. And then, of course, the entrance to the EU, which had been started by the government before me and was completed in the government in which my party was in coalition, and the Prime Minister was the socialist Mr. Stanishev, and that was January 1st, 2007, which was, of course, such a moving moment, because it was the goal of most of our fellow countrymen and my own, obviously, because that, to me, was that Bulgaria was in the right club or perimeter, or call it what you want, and I thank God for it to this day, because in the present crisis, imagine what a little country like Bulgaria would do on its own. So I do not want to underline it too heavily here, but I think that for Europe, EU membership is the only way out.
Well, you just to rewind, so you were Prime Minister for 4 years, but then there was another election, and although the Socialists got more votes, you were still part
Yes,
of it. You were in coalition.
In coalition for
and
another 4 years.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think any Prime Minister has ever been re-elected in Bulgaria, have they?
One who came after these two governments.
But not at that point, no one had ever been re-elected.
No.
So you did one term as Prime Minister.
In the democratic, period, it hadn't been.
So, and then you were in government again up until 2009.
Yes, 8 years.
So that's, I mean, to have been monarch, then to have been Prime Minister, or been in government all those years. 2009, finally, did you think, okay, I've done my bit, or do you know?
Well, in a way, yes. You must accept reality, facts, and also age, because I was getting on. So there was really not much to say or to do. And again, to me, the return of monarchy was something which I felt was not realistic. After 50 years of only terrific criticism or propaganda against it, it was very difficult to expect people to say, "Oh, how wonderful we need." They would always look at the other countries and the monarchies and see how successful they were. The example of King Juan Carlos was something which made them think that I would get, how can I say, achieve the same results. But of course, King Juan Carlos had been groomed, prepared, and backed by the Spanish government for 20 years. Instead, I had just arrived there.
And you had terrible propaganda, or you were always fighting that propaganda, weren't you?
Yes,
for
that
all
was
the years of exile, they've been saying, "Oh, the king, he ran off with millions of dollars."
Oh, at least, and all kinds of other things. And
but now you divide your time between Bulgaria.
no, I'm basically since 2000, I settled after 50 years of exile. You can understand that I was all too happy to be back at home, but I travel obviously because I have to. But it's getting more and more difficult at my age. I'm 85, so.
When you were Prime Minister, you write in the book about you were very keen not to bring your family with you because you didn't want them being, accused of seeking preferment.
I would have liked to have them to help me, because thank God they're all very capable people and could have really, but the anti-me lobby was so strong that they would immediately say, "That's nepotism, he wants to bring back monarchy." I mean, giving me a terrible time, but obviously also one of my sons, they sort of accepted in a way because he's a medic, he's a surgeon. So there they didn't think that there were any political risks or something. But otherwise they immediately would say, "Look at this, look at that." And they could have helped me, but I was very lonely, but I had to face the music. So
you were there on your own. I think you only had a cat for company when you were Prime Minister.
I mean, very important company.
And so if we could just sort of turn to the future, if I could ask first about your thoughts on the future of monarchy in Bulgaria, and then maybe more generally. But tell us where things stand now. I mean, you've never abdicated as Her late Majesty, as the current king. Everybody, as far as they're concerned, you are still the Tsar of the Bulgarians. But what happens to the crown, the Bulgarian crown, in the future?
Well, you see, our eldest son, died as a consequence of a car accident. So his son is the direct line. And eventually I thought that the solution was he can't be crown prince because he's not the son of a king. So again, to be realistic, I saw that in Romania they adopted this, and I thought it was quite right, is to just name him eventually the keeper or guardian of the crown, which means a lot or doesn't mean anything, but at least there's a certain, well, goes on in the tradition. But that's will happen when I'm no longer here.
Well, our current king, our new king, who was incidentally on that trip when he went back to Bulgaria when you were prime minister, I think he found it very uncomfortable that you, because you were prime minister, you were there, you were sort of treated below the president, and whereas he felt he should be showing deference to you because you were a king. But I think you're going to see him this week, aren't you?
I hope so.
Yeah.
He
heard, he got wind.
Like
but the palace got wind of the fact that His Majesty's here at Cliveden, so an invitation was forthcoming. Because I mean, you are the world's senior monarch, aren't you? No.
At this stage, yes.
Yeah.
Age-wise, it's King Harald of Norway, but otherwise, from the years that I've been on this position, I've become ominously senior.
But you look back over your career, and you were a sort of royal go-between. I mean, I noticed in your book at one point when King Hassan of Morocco wanted to get messages to King Juan Carlos, that would be through you. I mean, you knew all these.
Yes, because we had grown up together and we were friends, so sometimes it's easier to have a third party than the opposite party, so to speak.
And obviously you also, during that period, as well as knowing all these monarchs, you knew all these head of state. So when you joined NATO, you went to meet President Bush at the White House. But you also went to meet President Putin at one point. And I'd love to get your thoughts on where we are now. I know we haven't got too much time left, but let's look at the current situation. I mean, you're someone who's met...
I was the first prime minister after '89 to visit Moscow. The previous ones had avoided it, not to be accused of being pro-Russian or something. So it was a very difficult mission, but it worked, and President Putin, I think, realized it, so much so that in the last minute or an hour before the bilateral meeting, I was told that he would lead the Russian delegation and not my counterpart, Prime Minister Kasyanov. So I think there he gave a message to say, well, I appreciate what you've done, and for us, for Bulgaria, to keep good economic and other ties is very important. There's a huge Russian colony, if one can call them, who have flats in Bulgaria for the Black Sea or the skiing or one thing or another. We depend energy-wise totally, gas, oil, and nuclear fuel. So it's very difficult for us to find a way to join all the measures which are taken. Of course, Bulgaria is imposing sanctions, but I don't believe in sanctions. Sincerely, I think you're shooting yourself in the foot. It will hurt us by far more, us, I say the whole of the world, than Russia, because eventually it will hurt the people, but not the top.
What do you think will happen? What do you think?
Well, there it is. An escalation of more and more and more will only bring us to more confrontation and more loss of lives and what have you. I really think that, like in any other situation coming out of such crises, it's sitting at the table and seeing that everyone gives in a little bit in the name of the rest of the world. Otherwise, God forbid that we get to World War III, but the path we are now on, and this Manichaeism of only good on one side and only bad on the other side, I'm so old, I've seen so much. Nothing is perfect, nothing is only good or only bad. So I think we must be much more objective and less hysteric about hating Russia. What if you dislike Mr. Putin, that's one's privilege. But to attack Russia or anything Russian. There was a Bulgarian journalist not so long ago who said something very amusing. He said, "Don't confuse Putin with Pushkin." And it's true, culture is one thing, friendship of countries is another, but I mean, the chief of state is a different story.
Well, I think we certainly want to allow time for a few questions. So can I ask if anybody has a question there?
If anybody's awake.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you, Your Majesty. A quick question about the people you've met. In the course of your long and remarkable life, you must have met many statesmen and leaders and other monarchs from around the world. Can I ask which of them has impressed you most and why? And if you're prepared to say it, which of them has impressed you least? Thank you.
Which world leader, of all the statesmen and stateswomen you've met in your long life, which one has impressed you most and why, and which one, if you're prepared to say so?
It's very difficult to say one person, because that person maybe has a certain gift or what have you. Another one has in another sector, and yet it comes to the same. I really wouldn't be able to fairly answer your question, not out of diplomacy, simply because the way I see each one of them, they have their own merits in certain circumstances or in what I've lived or what concerns me. But I usually admire people who can negotiate, who can have a dialogue, people who try to understand the other party or the other side. I think that's very important.
Simon Seaback Montefiore.
Your Majesty, thank you so much. Fascinating stories and such a remarkable life you've had. A couple of things. One is, I'd love to know, are you particularly close or to your cousins who are the Royal House of Belgium, who are still the last Saxe-Coburg monarchy that survives? And also, I just wondered how much of your estates and properties in the country you've got in Bulgaria you've got back, and do you live in one of the palaces there?
Well, thank you. Our ties with the Belgians are more, are as almost, I would say, as cousins, as with Great Britain before the dynasty was called Windsor. But with the Belgians, it's also been a personal. My mother was very close and fond of King Leopold III, and we've been good friends with both King Baudouin and Albert, and of course the younger generation. So there's been quite a relationship. King Albert came and spent New Year's with us in Bulgaria a few years ago. But back to your question about our properties, in 1998, our properties were returned by the government by law, because in Bulgaria, every Bulgarian who had a claim of things that had been confiscated before the communist takeover was allowed to receive them, to reclaim them, is what we call restitution, which few former Soviet influenced countries did. So we, the royal family, got it back as any other Bulgarian citizen. It was not ad hoc for us. But after I had been the mean prime minister, there was several vendettas who started, and the return of our properties in '98 was questioned. We still have some lawsuits and things like this. That's human, I would say, between meanness and weakness. We have to assume it too, but we have some of our properties which are legally, and Strasbourg and whatever have, how can I say, recognized private property, which is one of the basics in a democracy. So it's also very important that we show a proper attitude as a Bulgaria, as a country, in respecting private property to improve investments in the country and not have people doubts about what can happen.
You've given quite a lot of property to the state.
Well,
haven't you?
we donated a park which is around the property where we live, right outside of Sofia. It's a public park. It's 180 acres roughly, which is a beautiful park that my grandfather had done. And that's visited on weekends. And there was a funny moment, I'm taking up your time, but when my sister and I donated it, there was a big tralala in the municipality, and the mayor very kindly thanked my sister and me for this very generous donation. And then he said, press conference. So everybody came around, and a young lady, first question, what else do you intend on giving? So I was completely taken aback, and I sort of answered, well, miss, I think that 180 acres for today is enough. But I saw the mayor's eyes. He would have shot the girl if he could, because he was so embarrassed by this question after all the nice words. And suddenly, what else are you going to give?
Those pesky journalists. Now, another question over there, yes. Wesley.
Fascinating, Your Majesty. What's the key thing that monarchy has to do to survive in the countries where it does survive, and should it survive?
Should monarchy survive, and what does it need to do to survive?
So that's a very, very, very important question, and it was so brilliantly debated and discussed this morning, and I haven't brought my crystal ball, but I quite sincerely, I can't even say that monarchy is the best, because I believe in always in seeing the positive part in one or another system. But honestly, I do think that monarchy has so many advantages and has proven it over millennia. It's not 50 years, 10 years or 20, that I quite honestly don't see that there is anything that should oppose it. It sounds anachronistic in a way, because we say democracy, you have to elect. But who is more specialized or more of a professional than a crown prince? Nobody. Because from the day he's born to the moment he becomes king, he's drilled, trained, prepared, so he's the best fellow to take this job. So I think that's also a pretty good guarantee, and it compensates for the fact that maybe the person isn't elected in a way. But I don't see really a threat to the countries which are monarchies. And I wish them, of course, luck, because in those countries things seem to function quite well, or less badly than in others.
Very good. One more question over there. Oh, sorry. We've got a...
Your Majesty, Edward Simon, so we might also be cousins. My question, your father's act of refusing to hand over the Jewish population of Bulgaria to the Nazis was unique and remarkable. Was that ever recognized in Israel in the Avenue of the Righteous?
Your father's refusal... Yes, I'm sorry about the aircraft, but saying your father's refusal to hand over the Jewish population to the Germans, he said was remarkable. Was it ever recognized in Israel?
But you see, sir, I try to, again, be as objective as possible. My father was head of state, and so that was the last word. But we also had the Bulgarian church, which are against any molesting of our Jews. The Bulgarian Communist Party, too. A good part of the population had no reason. So this put together made it that there was really a staunch opposition, and our Jewish community survived in an admirable way and left Bulgaria right after the end of the war. And I think it has been recognized, not by everybody, because there's political views of this issue. But you see, the last years of my father's rule, he had to take a very active part in running the country, let's put it this way. So when people say, but it's not the king's merit, it's everybody else except the king, if the king was running the show, at least part of the merits were his, because who would oppose and sort of object? But quite honestly, sir, I'm always very grateful for this and very proud as a Bulgarian that they point us out that we stood for our Jewish, how can I say, fellow countrymen and fellow countrywomen, because finally religion is something very personal. So why should one point out this? And we have a 14% of Muslims in Bulgaria. Why should we point out and say? So there I think that, and Bulgaria has been overrun in the past by so many civilizations, which makes us more tolerant. And it's thanks to this, I suppose, that our Jewish population did quite well after the war.
Well, I think there we have it. I'm sorry if other people had questions. The red light is saying that's it. But His Majesty is certainly going to be signing books shortly in the bookshop. His excellent book, here it is, which I have read. I can warmly recommend, A Unique Destiny, and it really is. It just reads. It's full of the most extraordinary stories.
Thank you.
Someone really has got to make it a film.
Major compliment.
Well, no, and it just remains for me to say thank you very much for coming, for flying in. I mean, for coming over with Queen Margarita. It's a pleasure to have you here and to see your son Kirill here as well with Jibba. And so could I just ask everyone to say thank you very much to His Majesty.